There is a dangerous lie whispered across the American heartland. It tells you that success is measured by the size of the loan you can carry, and that fresh green paint on a piece of heavy machinery will somehow buy you a better harvest. But when the world suddenly stops turning and the supply chains snap, that shiny metal becomes nothing more than a $500,000 tombstone sitting in a rotting field. Where are you watching this video from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Out in the sprawling, sun-baked expanses of Nebraska, the wind doesn't just blow, it speaks. It rolls across endless oceans of golden wheat, carrying the smell of dry dust, baked topsoil, and the heavy, undeniable pressure of the coming harvest. In this part of the country, a man's worth has always been tied to the dirt under his fingernails and the yield he can pull from the earth. But over the last few decades, something fundamental had shifted. The quiet pride of self-reliance had been slowly poisoned by a new kind of crop: debt. It crept into the county like a slow-moving sickness. You could see it in the way the local farmers looked at each other at the diner. It was no longer about who grew the strongest wheat or who knew how to turn a wrench to keep a 60-year-old tractor humming. It had become a toxic, silent competition of who could secure the biggest line of credit from the bank. The equipment dealers had become the new kings of the county, building massive glass-fronted showrooms that looked more like luxury car dealerships than places of agricultural business. They sold massive, air-conditioned leviathans equipped with satellite guidance, leather seats, and computer screens that told a man how to farm instead of letting him feel the earth beneath his boots. And the farmers bought them. They signed away their futures, taking on loans so massive they would take 3 generations to pay off, all for the illusion of looking successful. Jacob watched all of this from the porch of his modest farmhouse, a mug of black coffee cooling in his weathered hands. At 62 years old, Jacob was a man carved from the very loam he worked. He didn't say much because he didn't need to. His eyes, set deep behind a map of sun-worn wrinkles, had seen the brutal cycles of drought, flood, and market crashes. He possessed a kind of quiet, impenetrable stoicism that made the younger, flashier men in town deeply uncomfortable. While his neighbors, men like Tom, who farmed the acreage just south of him, were busy remortgaging their grandfather's land to buy 6-figure machines, Jacob was out in his barn, re-welding the frame of an ancient disc harrow. Jacob understood physics. He understood leverage, torque, and the undeniable truth that metal, sweat, and gravity didn't charge interest. He knew every sound his farm made, from the rhythmic breathing of his draft horses in the stables to the exact pitch of a worn bearing crying out for grease. To Jacob, the modern agricultural world felt like a house of cards built on top of a powder keg. Men were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to harvest a crop that paid pennies on the pound, entirely reliant on a fragile, invisible global supply chain to bring them the diesel fuel required to turn the keys. They were mortgaging their souls to the bank, trading their independence for convenience. The heavy air of debt hung over the county, invisible but suffocating. As the midsummer heat began to bake the Nebraska plains, signaling the rapid approach of the harvest season, the tension in the valley was palpable. The wheat was turning a deep, rich amber, drying out perfectly in the relentless sun. It was going to be a bumper crop, a record-breaking yield that had every man in town dreaming of paying down their crushing banknotes. But Jacob, watching the horizon with a steady, calculating gaze, felt a different kind of shift in the wind. He didn't know exactly what was coming, but he knew the golden rule of the American pioneer. When you owe your life to the bank and your fuel to the world, you are never truly free. The automatic glass doors of the Heartland Ag dealership slid open with a soft, synthetic hiss, a sound entirely out of place in a town built on wind and grit. Inside, the showroom was a cathedral of modern consumption. The floor was polished white concrete, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights above, and the air smelled of stale corporate espresso and brand new synthetic rubber. It was a sterile, climate-controlled bubble that had nothing to do with farming and everything to do with finance. Jacob stepped inside, his scuffed, oil-stained leather work boots leaving faint traces of genuine Nebraska topsoil on the pristine floor. He hadn't come to buy a tractor. He had just come looking for a simple hydraulic gasket for his old Ford. But in a place like this, an older man carrying cash for a $10 part was nothing but a target. Before Jacob could even reach the parts counter, a shadow fell over him. It was Bradley. At 35, Bradley was the dealership's top earner. He wore a crisp, branded polo shirt that had never seen a drop of grease, his hair slicked back perfectly, his teeth unnaturally white. He had the hungry, restless eyes of a coyote, calculating the distance to a wounded calf. "Jacob, good to see you off the homestead," Bradley boomed, his voice echoing off the high steel ceilings. His tone carried that familiar, condescending warmth of a man about to ask for your signature. "I was just telling the boys in the back, Jacob is going to wear himself into an early grave running that antique junk. Come over here. I want to show you the future." Bradley placed a heavy hand on Jacob's shoulder, attempting to steer him toward the center of the showroom. Sitting there under a rack of spotlights was a monstrous piece of harvesting equipment. It was a towering fortress of green and yellow steel, equipped with an enclosed cab, a dozen digital monitors, and a header wider than Jacob's entire barn. "This right here is the answer to all your problems," Bradley said, patting the massive tire with a well-manicured hand. "We are running a seasonal promotion. I can put you in the seat of this beauty today. We are talking a flat $100,000 financing package to walk out the door, customized just for you. We stretch the note out over 10, maybe 15 years. The bank is practically giving the money away, Jacob. You sign today, you cut your harvest time by 80%. No more sweating in the dust." Jacob stood perfectly still, his calloused hands resting calmly at his sides. He looked up at the machine. He didn't see a modern marvel of engineering. He saw a cage. He looked at the massive 100-gallon fuel tank, calculating the terrifying daily burn rate. He looked at the proprietary computer sensors that required a corporate technician at $200 an hour just to reset a flashing light. And then he calculated the invisible chain of a $100,000 debt tying him to a bank in New York for the rest of his natural life. "It is a lot of machine, Bradley," Jacob said, his voice low and steady, rumbling like a distant thunderstorm. "But the math doesn't pencil out. A man doesn't own a machine like that. The machine owns him. I will stick to what I have." Bradley's forced smile instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, mocking smirk. The mask had slipped. He took a step back, intentionally raising his voice so the other farmers hovering near the complimentary coffee station could hear. "Math? You want to talk about math, Jacob?" Bradley laughed loudly, a sharp, metallic sound. "The math says you are a stubborn old fool living in the past. You are going to break your back out there while the rest of the world moves on. You cannot fight progress with rust and stubborn pride." A few chuckles drifted over from the coffee station. Tom, Jacob's neighbor, was standing there holding a thick folder of loan documents, looking slightly embarrassed but nodding along with the salesman. "He is right, Jacob," Tom called out nervously. "You got to spend money to make money. It is the only way to survive now." Jacob slowly turned his head to look at Tom, taking in the dark bags under the younger farmer's eyes, the visible weight of the debt already crushing his shoulders. Jacob didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held Bradley's arrogant gaze for a long, heavy moment. "Progress is a fine thing, Bradley," Jacob said softly, the silence of the showroom amplifying his words. "But I have never seen a banknote grow wheat, and I have never seen a computer pull a plow when the diesel runs dry." Without waiting for a response, Jacob turned his back on the towering green machine, on the slick salesman, and on the quiet laughter of his neighbors. He walked out the automatic sliding doors, stepping back into the harsh, honest heat of the Nebraska sun, leaving the men in the air-conditioned room to their illusions of wealth. 2 weeks after the incident at the dealership, the dusty perimeter of the old Miller estate looked less like a farm and more like a graveyard for forgotten iron. The bank had finally come for the Miller family, foreclosing on 3 generations of hard work to settle a mountain of bad loans. Now everything they owned was laid out on the trampled grass, waiting for the auctioneer's gavel. Pickup trucks lined the county road for a mile in either direction, kicking up a thick, choking haze of pulverized topsoil that settled over the crowd like a heavy shroud. Jacob walked quietly along the back row of the auction lot, far away from the shiny, late-model tractors and hydraulic implements that had drawn the big-money crowds. He preferred the edges, the places where the discarded remnants of true American agriculture were left to rot. He moved past rows of rusted oil drums, broken fence posts, and cracked feed troughs. Then, half buried in a tangle of overgrown bull thistles and creeping vines, he saw it. It was an original, late 19th century horse-drawn grain binder. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than a twisted heap of oxidized scrap metal and rotting wood. But Jacob's eyes were not untrained. He walked slowly around the machine, his calloused fingers brushing away the dried weeds to trace the lines of the heavy, cast-iron frame. He saw the massive, lugged bull wheel resting in the dirt. He understood the profound, forgotten genius behind its design, a purely ground-driven mechanical marvel. As a team of horses pulled the rig forward, the traction of that single, massive iron wheel turning against the earth transferred kinetic energy through a series of exposed, perfectly geared cogs. That raw, forward momentum powered everything. The spinning reel that gathered the wheat, the reciprocating sickle bar that sliced the stalks, the canvas elevators that carried the grain, and the intricate, almost magical mechanical knotter that tied it all into perfect bundles. It required zero electricity, zero hydraulic fluid, and not a single drop of diesel fuel. It ran on nothing but sweat, gravity, and the brilliant application of leverage. All right, folks, moving on to the scrap pile, the auctioneer's rapid-fire voice crackled through a distorted portable speaker. The crowd shuffled over, a mass of sweaty brows and feed store caps. I have a rusted-out horse binder here. Good for yard art or melting down. Who gives me $20? $10 just to haul it away. I will give you 40, Jacob said, his voice cutting clearly through the humid morning air. The crowd fell silent for a fraction of a second before a ripple of laughter broke out. Heads turned. Men nudged each other, pointing at the old farmer standing next to the pile of rusted junk. $40? Tom's voice rang out from the back of the crowd. He was leaning against the bed of a brand-new, financed luxury pickup truck, a fresh wad of chewing tobacco tucked in his cheek. Jacob, you really have lost your mind this time. Are you opening a museum out there on your property, or are you just trying to build the world's ugliest paperweight? A few of the younger farmers, guys who had just signed their lives away on massive green combines, laughed even louder. Maybe he thinks he's going to pull it with his lawnmower, one of them hollered. Jacob didn't flinch. He didn't turn around to meet their mocking stares, and he certainly didn't offer an explanation. The psychological toll of being an outcast in a small rural community is a heavy burden to carry. It is a lonely road to walk when the entire town looks at you as a stubborn relic of a dead era. But Jacob's pride was not tied to their approval. He simply reached into the chest pocket of his faded canvas work jacket, pulled out 2 crisp $20 bills, and handed them to the clerk. As he slowly winched the heavy, rusted binder onto his weathered flatbed trailer, the whispers and the snickers continued behind his back. They looked at him and saw a man dragging himself backward into poverty. They didn't realize they were looking at the only man in the county who was quietly preparing a lifeboat, while the rest of them were happily buying tickets on a sinking ship. Jacob's barn was a sanctuary of old timber, smelling of sweet alfalfa, aged leather, and the sharp, clean scent of kerosene. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, dictated not by digital clocks or frantic market tickers, but by the rising sun and the needs of the land. In the center of the dirt floor sat the rusted skeleton of the horse-drawn grain binder. For 3 straight days, Jacob barely left the barn. He worked with the quiet, deliberate patience of a surgeon, stripping away decades of neglect and exposing the bare iron beneath. Across the property line, the suffocating roar of a 6-cylinder turbocharged diesel engine shattered the morning peace. Tom was firing up his finance Leviathan, testing the modern hydraulics and blowing thick, synthetic black smoke into the pristine Nebraska sky. The ground beneath Jacob's boots literally vibrated from the raw, violent horsepower of his neighbor's machine. But Jacob didn't look out the window. He kept his head down, a rag soaked in penetrating oil in one hand and a stiff wire brush in the other, methodically scrubbing the rust off a massive cast-iron sprocket. He was studying the soul of the machine. The sheer genius of the 1880s design lay in its profound simplicity. The entire contraption relied on one single point of contact with the earth, the bull wheel. As that heavy, lugged iron wheel rolled across the dirt, it grabbed the ground, turning forward momentum into raw rotational torque. Through a heavy interlocking drive chain, that torque was distributed to every moving part of the binder. Jacob marveled at the physics of it. It was a masterclass in mechanical advantage. There were no fragile microchips to short out, no high-pressure hydraulic lines to burst. It was just iron, geometry, and friction working in perfect, unbreakable harmony. The true heart of the binder, however, was the knotter. Jacob spent an entire afternoon sitting on an overturned bucket, carefully disassembling the intricate metal fingers that made up the tying mechanism. It was a dizzying maze of cams, gears, and springs designed to catch a length of twine, wrap it around a gathered bundle of cut wheat, tie a flawless knot, and slice the string clean, all in the fraction of a second, entirely powered by the rotation of the bullwheel. If a single tension spring was off by a millimeter, the knot would fail, and the wheat would scatter. Jacob cleaned every groove, applied fresh grease, and tuned the springs by feel, relying on the deep muscle memory in his fingertips. Next came the canvas. The binder relied on wide, heavy canvas belts moving over wooden rollers to carry the cut stalks of wheat up to the binding deck. Jacob spent hours with a heavy needle and waxed thread, stitching repairs into the thick fabric, ensuring the tension was perfectly balanced. As he worked, he listened to the rhythmic, heavy breathing coming from the wide wooden stalls at the back of the barn. Duke and Buster, his team of dappled gray Percheron draft horses, stood quietly eating their morning oats. Together, they represented over 4,000 pounds of pure, unadulterated muscle. They were the true engine of Jacob's modest 200-acre operation. They didn't require expensive imported diesel. They didn't need proprietary computer updates from an arrogant dealership. They ran on the very grass and grain the farm produced, returning rich fertilizer back to the soil in a perfect, closed-loop system. Jacob walked over, running a stiff brush over Duke's massive shoulder, feeling the incredible, latent power shifting beneath the horse's coat. By the end of the week, the pile of scrap metal was gone. In its place stood a fully restored, heavily oiled piece of agricultural history. To test his work, Jacob grabbed the thick iron spokes of the heavy bullwheel and threw his weight into it, forcing it to turn a quarter rotation. Instantly, the machine came alive. The wooden pitman arms snapped back and forth, driving the sickle bar with a sharp, satisfying clack, clack, clack. The canvas belts glided smoothly over the rollers. The metal knotters cycled with a crisp, perfect snap. It was ready. Out in the valley, the modern farmers were anxiously watching the weather, their massive fuel tanks thirsty, waiting for the heavy diesel trucks to make their weekly deliveries. But in the quiet cool of his barn, Jacob wiped the heavy grease from his hands. He was completely self-contained, debt-free, and waiting for the wheat to turn. Late August arrived in the valley with a suffocating, breathless heat. Out in the fields, the wheat had turned a brittle, pale gold, the heavy heads of grain bowing under their own weight. To a farmer, this is the most critical window of the year. The crop was bone dry and ready to harvest, but the longer it sat in the field, the greater the risk. A sudden late summer hailstorm or a string of heavy winds could shatter the stalks, spilling a year's worth of wages into the dirt. The entire county was wound tight as a coiled spring. Men were in their pristine steel sheds, greasing the bearings on their massive green combines, calculating their expected yields, and praying the payouts would be enough to cover the massive banknotes coming due on the first of the month. But the collapse didn't start in the fields. It started on the crackling AM radio dials of pickup trucks and the scrolling text on the nightly news. It was a perfect storm of modern fragility. A severe international trade embargo locked down critical overseas shipping lanes, followed almost immediately by a catastrophic, cascading failure at 3 of the largest domestic petroleum refineries on the coast. The highly optimized, incredibly delicate global supply chain that the modern world relied upon simply snapped. There was no backup plan. There was no reserve. The dominoes fell with terrifying, silent speed, racing from the coastal ports straight into the heart of the American Midwest. Within 48 hours, the price of agricultural off-road diesel doubled. Farmers who usually ordered fuel by the thousands of gallons hesitated, hoping the market would correct itself. But the next morning, the price tripled. A shockwave of panic rippled through the valley. A mile-long convoy of dusty pickup trucks, their beds loaded with empty plastic transfer tanks, choked the 2-lane highway leading to the county agricultural co-op. Tom was near the front of the line, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel of his financed luxury truck. He watched in cold sweat as the numbers on the fuel pump's digital ticker spun violently out of control, draining his checking account just to fill a meager 100-gallon tank. But the high prices were only the beginning of the nightmare. By the end of the week, the real disaster struck. The massive chrome-plated tanker trucks that kept the rural arteries pumping simply stopped rolling. Regional allocations were strictly, heavily restricted. The local co-ops shut off their pumps, dragged a heavy yellow logging chain across the entrance, and hung a piece of cardboard with thick black marker. No diesel. Pumps dry. Do not ask. The trap had finally sprung closed. The illusion of modern security shattered overnight. Tom stood in his gravel driveway, staring blankly at the massive $100,000 combine he had signed his life away for. The Leviathan held a 250-gallon fuel tank. To fill it, even if he could find black market fuel, would cost more cash than he had to his name. And without fuel, the computer-guided, air-conditioned marvel of engineering was absolutely useless. It was a $500,000 anchor sinking him into the dirt. Every day the wheat sat unharvested, the bank's shadow grew longer. The automated loan collection letters from corporate offices in New York were already arriving in the mailboxes of panicked farmers, demanding payments regardless of the global crisis. The county descended into a chaotic paralysis. Men gathered at the diner, their faces pale, shouting about politicians, screaming at the dealership representatives who suddenly refused to answer their phones. The arrogant, slick salesmen like Bradley were nowhere to be found, hiding behind locked showroom doors as their own corporate financing structures began to implode. Yet 2 miles down the road, sitting on his wooden porch, Jacob drank his morning coffee in absolute peace. He didn't have a television, and he didn't care about international shipping lanes. He looked out over his 200 acres of golden, waving wheat. He felt the dry wind against his weathered face. He heard the deep, rhythmic stomping of Duke and Buster in the barn. The catastrophic shockwave that was bringing the modern world to its knees stopped completely at Jacob's property line. He set his coffee mug down. It was time to go to work. Dawn broke over the Nebraska plains with a cruel, mocking beauty. Normally, this was the morning the valley would wake to the unified, earth-shaking roar of heavy diesel engines. It was supposed to be the mechanical symphony of the harvest, 100 massive green and red combines firing up to chew through the golden ocean of wheat. Instead, there was only the wind. The silence in the valley was unnatural. It was deafening. It was the sound of complete, terrifying paralysis. Out in the vast fields, the modern leviathans sat exactly where they had been parked days ago, trapped in the dirt like massive, useless monuments to human arrogance. The sun beat down on their expensive tinted cab windows and their high-tech satellite guidance receivers. Without fuel, their $500,000 price tags meant absolutely nothing. They were just cold, dead iron. Tom stood at the edge of his property line, his boots sinking into the dry, cracking topsoil. He had not slept in 3 days. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached out to crush a head of wheat between his fingers. It was bone dry. The kernel shattered perfectly. The crop was ready. It had been ready for 48 hours. Every single hour it sat unharvested in the scorching sun, the risk of the heavy heads shattering and dropping the precious grain to the dirt multiplied. A year of blood, sweat, and chemicals was sitting right in front of him, and he could not touch it. He looked back at his brand-new combine sitting near the barn. The digital fuel gauge rested permanently on empty. He had spent the last 2 days desperately calling every supplier, every black market hauler, every neighboring county co-op within a 200-mile radius. There was nothing. The few thousand gallons of diesel that remained in the state were being strictly rationed by the government for emergency medical services and law enforcement. Agriculture, the backbone of the country, had been told to wait. But the bank was not waiting. The rural mail carrier had driven by an hour ago, dropping a thick, certified envelope into Tom's metal mailbox. He did not even need to tear it open to know what it said. The grace periods were over. The corporate algorithms in New York did not factor in global supply chain collapses or empty local fuel pumps. They only registered a missed payment on a 6-figure equipment loan. The automated foreclosure processes were already quietly grinding into motion, preparing to swallow the land his grandfather had cleared by hand. Tom was not the only one. Up and down the county road, men who had spent the last 5 years bragging about their credit lines and their climate-controlled cabs were completely broken. They were gathering in small, hushed groups at the edges of their driveways, staring out at the millions of dollars of rotting grain they could not harvest. The arrogance that had filled the air-conditioned dealership showroom just weeks prior had entirely evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, collective despair. They were watching their family legacies turn to dust in the wind. Down at the Heartland Ag dealership, the situation was just as bleak. The automatic glass doors were locked from the inside. Bradley, the slick salesman who had mocked Jacob so loudly, sat in a darkened office, his expensive tie loosened, staring blankly at a computer monitor flashing red numbers. The corporate parent company had frozen all new credit lines. And today was locked down. The farmers were defaulting en masse, and the dealership was suddenly holding millions of dollars in unsellable, unfuelable inventory. The debt-fueled machine they had worshipped had finally eaten them alive. Back on the dirt road, Tom wiped a layer of sweat and grit from his forehead. He looked south, toward the Miller estate where the scrap auction had been, and then further down the fence line, toward Jacob's property. Through the heavy, silent heat of the late morning, a new sound began to drift across the valley. It was not the violent, turbocharged scream of a modern engine. It was rhythmic. It was steady. It was the distinct, metallic clack, clack, clack of a reciprocating sickle bar, accompanied by the deep, heavy thud of massive hooves hitting the dirt. Tom squinted against the glaring sun, his breath catching in his throat, completely unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Through the shimmering heat haze rising off the county road, an apparition emerged. It started as a dark silhouette, distorted by the blistering Nebraska sun, accompanied by the deep, percussive thud of heavy iron shoes striking the baked earth. It was Duke and Buster. Over 4,000 pounds of dappled gray muscle leaned heavily into their thick leather collars, their massive chests pushing forward with slow, unstoppable momentum. Behind the draft team rode Jacob. He was perched high on the cast-iron seat of the 1880s binder, an old straw hat pulled low against the glaring sky, the heavy leather driving lines held loosely but firmly in his calloused hands. He didn't have a climate-controlled cab. He didn't have digital monitors, satellite guidance, or a cushioned pneumatic suspension. He had the punishing heat, the choking dust, and the undeniable, raw reality of motion. As the massive team stepped off the dirt road and into the edge of Jacob's golden wheat field, the heavily lugged bull wheel of the binder bit hard into the dry topsoil. That single point of friction against the earth awakened the beast. The heavy iron drive chain pulled taut. The intricate system of exposed gears engaged. Suddenly, the quiet, paralyzed morning air was filled with a sharp, metallic clatter. Clack, 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 clack. It was the wooden pitman arm snapping the 5-foot sickle bar back and forth with vicious, reciprocating speed. The razor-sharp triangular teeth sliced perfectly through the brittle, sun-baked stalks, severing the wheat a few inches above the dirt. The spinning wooden reel gently pushed the heavy, golden heads backward, dropping them onto the moving canvas elevator. Word spread down the county road faster than a dry prairie fire. Men who had spent the last 3 days locked in their kitchens, staring blankly at automated bank foreclosure notices and empty fuel gauges, began to drift out of their driveways. They walked to the barbed wire fence line dividing the properties, their faces pale and drawn beneath their sunburns. Tom stood among them, his hands gripping the top wire so hard his knuckles turned white. They watched in absolute, stunned silence. No one made a joke about the $40 piece of scrap metal now. The sheer, crushing humiliation of the moment washed over them like a physical wave. They had traded their grandfather's self-reliance for a corporate lie, and now they were forced to watch a quiet old man prove exactly how foolish they had been. But the true magic, the forgotten genius that held the modern farmers utterly spellbound, was the nodder. They watched the canvas belts carry the cut wheat up to the binding deck. The moment enough stalks gathered, the mechanical trip arm fired. In a blur of motion too fast for the human eye to track, a curved steel needle shot upward, wrapping a length of heavy sisal twine around the bundle. Intricate metal fingers grabbed the twine, tied a flawless knot, and a hidden blade snapped it clean. A wooden kicker arm thrust outward, dropping a perfectly bound sheaf of wheat onto the dirt. Thump. A few seconds later, thump. Then again, thump. It was the steady, unbreakable rhythm of the harvest. Jacob never looked over at the fence line. He never glanced at the multi-million-dollar line of dead green machines rusting in the neighboring fields. His eyes were locked firmly on the ears of his horses, feeling the slight, living shifts in their gait through the leather lines, listening to the metallic heartbeat of the binder. He was a man entirely in his element, operating a flawless, closed-loop system of survival. By noon, the sun was a relentless hammer. Sweat poured down Jacob's weathered face, stinging his eyes and turning the dust on his skin to mud. Duke and Buster were dark with sweat, thick white foam building under their heavy leather breeching. But they did not stop. They didn't need a fragile international supply chain. They didn't need the permission of a slick salesman in a glass showroom. They only needed the grain they had eaten that morning and the steady hand of the man who raised them. While the rest of the county drowned in the invisible weight of their massive banknotes, paralyzed by a crisis they could not control, Jacob methodically carved his way through the amber waves of grain, completely free. It took Jacob exactly 9 days to clear his 200 acres. He worked from the moment the morning dew burned off the stalks until the heavy Midwestern sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and red. Behind him, the field was transformed. Where there was once a terrifying ocean of overripe grain threatening to shatter, there now stood hundreds of perfectly tied shocks of wheat, resting quietly on the stubble like golden monuments to honest labor. He loaded the bundles onto his wooden wagon, letting Duke and Buster pull the heavy harvest back to the barn to be threshed. His silos were full. His seed for the next year was secured. He had not burned a single drop of diesel fuel, and he did not owe a single red cent to the men in the glass towers. By late September, the brutal reality of the crisis had permanently reshaped the county. The sprawling Heartland Ag dealership on the edge of town was a ghost town. Its automatic sliding doors were chained shut, and the massive, polished showroom was dark. The corporate banks that had pushed the easy financing had violently reversed course, swallowing the dealership whole. In the dead of night, fleets of heavy transport trucks arrived to repossess the $500,000 combines, hauling them away to be liquidated for pennies on the dollar. Bradley, the slick salesman who had laughed so loudly at Jacob's rusty Ford, was gone, his leased luxury sedan repossessed, his career as a high roller completely erased by the very system he worshipped. The silence that blanketed the neighboring farms was no longer just the absence of engines. It was the hollow, suffocating silence of defeat. One cool autumn evening, as Jacob was out in the barn rubbing a heavy coat of neat's foot oil into his driving harnesses, a shadow fell across the open doorway. It was Tom. The younger farmer looked 10 years older than he had just a month prior. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone. His shoulders were slumped, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his faded jacket. Out in Tom's fields, the unharvested wheat had completely shattered in a series of heavy thunderstorms, turning a year of his life and hundreds of thousands of dollars of borrowed money into a rotting mat of wet straw. Tom didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, listening to the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the massive draft horses, smelling the sweet scent of a safely stored harvest. "I came over here to laugh at you, Jacob," Tom finally whispered, his voice cracking with a dry, bitter exhaustion. "When you brought that old pile of iron back from the auction, I called you a fool. I told everyone you were crazy." He looked down at the dirt floor, unable to meet the older man's steady gaze. "The bank is taking the farm, Jacob. They took the tractor yesterday. The land goes on the auction block next month. We lost everything." Jacob stopped his work. He wiped the excess oil from his hands with a clean rag. He did not smile. He did not puff out his chest or remind Tom of the jokes and the public humiliation. A true pioneer does not find joy in the destruction of his neighbor. "They sold you a comfortable lie, Tom," Jacob said quietly, walking over and placing a heavy, calloused hand on the younger man's shoulder. "They told you that progress meant giving up your independence. They convinced you that a man's worth is measured by how much credit a bank is willing to extend him. But debt isn't wealth. It is just a chain. And a machine that relies on the rest of the world to function isn't an asset. It is a liability." Tom looked up, the tears pooling in the corners of his exhausted eyes. He was finally seeing the world clearly, stripped of the marketing and the corporate promises. "You can't buy freedom with a signature," Jacob continued, looking out toward the darkening horizon. "You have to build it with your own 2 hands. You have to understand the dirt you stand on and the tools you use. The world will always try to sell you the easy way out, but the easy way is the first thing to break when the wind changes direction." The quiet farmer from Nebraska had not moved backward in time. He was simply the only man who had anchored himself to the bedrock of reality, while the rest of the world built their mansions on shifting sand. If you believe in the power of hard work and keeping debt off your back, hit that subscribe button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it.